Have you ever come out of the cinema and thought, that's an hour and a half of my life I'll never get back? I can endure rubbish, but the worst film I ever went to see was Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. To this day, I can't tell you what it was about. I've tried to wipe all memory of it from my brain. I refused point blankly to go to the sequel, so there must have been a few people who got it and enjoyed it. When we consider going to watch a film, we can question if it's going to be worthwhile. Will it be a good use of time? When we pick up a book, we can have the same question. Is it worth reading? Will it be a good use of time? When we go to a lecture, listen to a sermon, even attend an event, we wonder if it's going to be worthwhile. Will it be a good use of time? This evening we want to begin a series from Romans, and I want to suggest that this is going to be a good use of time. I want to look at three things from the opening chapter this evening. Romans, it's worth reading. Romans, it's worth getting excited about. And Romans, it's worth letting it challenge you. The first thing I want us to consider, is it worth reading? One of the joys of going to New Wine is the variety of speakers there are. My approach tends to be, no matter who they are or what they're talking about, there's always going to be something you can get from their talk. There are some speakers, though, you know that just sat under their ministry is going to be a blessing. They may affirm what you're doing, challenge the way you think, or totally reframe your paradigm. But you know you're going to be blessed. And we're so thankful for their ministry. There's only ever been one speaker I've absolutely point-blankly refused to go to listen to. When friends who we go with came back, they wanted to know why I'd not warned them that the speaker would be so bad. It was a couple of hours that they would never get back. As we pick up Romans, is it worth reading? Paul begins, as most Roman letters begin, by saying who the letter was from. Paul. In other words, the letter was worth reading. If you knew Paul, you'd hang on his every word. If you knew about Paul, you'd be curious about what he had to say. Even if you were not a great fan of Paul, you could not ignore what he had written. It needed reading. He describes himself in verse 1 as a servant and an apostle. A servant was someone totally at the disposal of their master, and an apostle was an official minister of the gospel, called and appointed by God. What he had to say could not be ignored. Roll up your sleeves, it's worth engaging with. Paul goes on to say it's worth reading. When everything is stripped away, the gospel rises and falls on the truth of Jesus' resurrection. Verse 4. We love singing when I survey the wondrous cross, but really what we should delight in is when I survey the empty tomb. People may be put off church by the way that we do things, the people we welcome, the doubts and questions they have that remain unanswered. But at the end of the day, the tomb was empty. It's that truth. The resurrection happened that changes everything and makes it worth reading. The authority of the resurrection, Jesus did rise from the dead, trumps everything else and makes reading and reflecting on it an absolute necessity. Paul goes on to talk about the calling his readers have received. He describes it as being called to belong to Jesus. We have the honour and privilege of being personally called by God to belong to him. Think about that calling. Treasure your response. Guard against the truth of it being eroded by doubts and temptations of this world and the spiritual forces of evil at work that would like to question its evidence. We have been chosen by God to receive the forgiveness of the cross and the eternal hope of the resurrection. Read on. As Paul starts out, he wants us to be convinced that Romans is worth investing our time and energy in understanding. The second thing I want us to consider, it's worth getting excited about. Not only is it worth reading, it's worth allowing it to touch your heart. We are incredibly sensitive people. If your senses are working normally, you can feel on your fingertips or face a pressure that depresses your skin a mere 0.01 of a millimetre. See a small candle flame from 30 miles away on a clear dark night. Smell one drop of perfume diffused through a 3-bedroom flat. Take 1 gram of table salt dissolved in 600 litres of water. Feel the weight of a bee's wing falling on your cheek from less than 1 centimetre away. Distinguish between more than 300,000 different colour variations. Gauge the direction of a sound's origin based on 0.00003 second difference in its arrival from one ear to the other. We are incredibly sensitive people, and we want to be sensitive to people around us. And it can be hard at this moment in time. Do we lighten the mood and come across as too flippant? Or do we take ourselves so seriously we come across with such sobriety that we compound people struggling? It's hard to get it just right. Paul leaves us in no doubt that the correct response to reading Romans is one of excitement. Paul is excited about the joy and privilege of praying. He says in verse 8, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you. And he goes on to say, how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. It's a joy to pray for people because there is much in them to be thankful for. If you're feeling the isolation blues, grab the church fellowship book and go through it giving thanks to God for the people, and you'll thank yourself happy. God's people are truly wonderful because they're a living example of God's grace at work. It's a delight to give thanks over them. But it's a delight at all times and in all places as they come to mind to pray for them. Paul can't help it. He has to pray for people, and it's worth getting excited about. Paul is excited about the privilege of fellowship. He says in verse 11, I long to see you, and the purpose flows that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. We travel through this life not alone, but surrounded by people who want to champion us on our walk with God. It's a privilege, though at the moment Paul is experiencing the frustration of being separated. We can understand something of how he feels. We long to be together, and while Zoom and Skype and other medium are such wonderful servants, nothing beats meeting face to face. And that's what Paul longs for. He longs to meet the Romans face to face. He looks forward to the day that he can see them, that they can mutually encourage one another. And I guess we do the same, don't we? Perhaps this time apart helps us realise the privilege it is to meet together. It's not something we should ever take for granted, but it's worth getting excited about. Paul is excited about the privilege of proclaiming. He tells us in verse 15 that he is eager to preach the gospel. He doesn't care who he tells about Jesus, Greeks or non-Greeks. Everyone is worth getting excited about telling. Jesus is good news to all people, and especially at this time, we should be sensing an increased urgency. People are dying without knowing Jesus. And Jesus is the answer, and we should be excited and unapologetic about making him known. Paul is excited about the privilege of believing. These are perhaps the key verses in Romans. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. We live in a hostile world that can make us timid, apologetic, even fearful about believing, and we shrink back from sharing our faith with other people. For Paul, the gospel is the absolute truth, the life-changing truth, and it's worth getting excited about. Who we have believed in is the hope for the nations, so we shouldn't be timid about what we believe. Rather, there should be a holy boldness, not natural bluster, not an insensitivity to those we're speaking to, but a holy boldness in our excitement to tell others about what we believe and live according to unapologetically in this world. We're fully persuaded and will not step back. Jesus is worth getting excited about. And Paul encourages us as we read this letter to allow the Spirit of God to stir us up, to become spiritually excited about our faith so we will not shrink back. The third thing I want us to consider, it is worth letting it challenge you. A wealthy businessman who was well known for being ruthless and ethical told Mark Twain that before he died, he wanted to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He said that when he got there, he wanted to climb to the top of Mount Sinai, where Moses had received the Ten Commandments, and there read the Ten Commandments aloud at the top. "I have a better idea," replied Twain in his typical wit. "You could stay in Boston and keep them." Paul wants us to be excited about our faith, but he's not going to hold back in telling us about the challenge we face. It's easy to be overwhelmed or overly sensitive to what is happening around us that we temper our excitement. Now is not the right time. However, I dare to suggest now is exactly the right time, but it's not without its challenges. And I think he highlights 4 challenges. The first challenge is the blindness of the world. Paul says that people are without excuse and sums it up in verse 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. People would prefer to believe anything other than acknowledge the existence of God. Creation is God's advertising hoarding, and rather than exploring how God might make things or how God might sustain things, the world is desperate to explain away any need for God. The blindness Paul talks of is a choice. It is a hard and obstinate blindness that refuses to open its eyes and take a look. The second challenge is the folly of the world. In a moment of candour, people know that there is a God. It's interesting how many people in this present climate are asking more spiritual questions. There's more to life than this headless rush to be busy. Deep down, everyone has a divine curiosity. Yet in the folly, the world can suppress it. Paul says, for that although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Jeremiah captures human folly very well when he writes, they say to wood, you are my father, and to stone, you gave me birth. How easily we create idols in our hearts, fashioned by our own hands, and call them gods, or at least serve them as gods. Even if it is our own human reason or the pronouncements of science, we bow the knee to them. It's hard to reason with such folly. The third challenge is the depravity of the world. The root of depravity is what Paul describes in verse 25. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Adam and Eve thought that God was holding out on them, so they took matters into their own hands. Every generation has thought God is holding out on them. Somehow he's set out to spoil their fun, and they've taken matters into their own hands, embraced all manner of behaviour that's less than the best that God intended. For Paul, this is manifest in all manner of depraved sexual relations. In a promiscuous world that even teaches children all manner of perversion is normal and acceptable if done in a loving, committed relationship, will always twist God's truth and God's best for people because we've settled for a morality of the gutter. God wants to bring life-enhancing joy, but people think they know better. Their minds have become depraved by how much rubbish they've become involved with. The fourth challenge is the challenge of ungodliness, the ungodliness of the world. Paul says in verse 29, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. In other words, every area of life has become tainted with a refusal to embrace the wisdom of God. Life has become brutal and there's no escaping this downward spiral of depravity. In order to justify their own behaviour, they drag others in. Paul writes, they not only continue to do these things, but also approve of those who practice them. They want others to justify their depraved behaviour. It's not a private matter, something people keep to themselves, but something they want the whole of society to embrace and run headlong into the same ungodliness. It's hard speaking the truth into reversing the direction of the momentum they have created. In the shaking that we're experiencing during this pandemic, people are asking serious questions about the behaviour of humanity. Inevitably, there'll be those that want to carry on as normal, but we, in our excitement for the truth, need to pray that this will be the opportunity that people and families reassess their approach to life and return to God. Pray for a stirring where real spiritual hunger means a searching after the truth of God, and they too become excited about Jesus. Is Romans worth reading? Paul wants us to know that it surely is a good use of time, but it will not be without challenges, because we'll come up against a world that doesn't want to hear the truth contained in it. But we're not shaken. We will read, we'll allow it to shape us, and we'll speak truth into the relationships of those around us that we enjoy.